We are continuing on with our months-long discussion about the Eucharist. First, we talked about the sacrament of the Eucharist itself, the theology behind it, and then we looked at several Eucharistic miracles, and last week we finished up talking about the liturgy and what it is. The final thing that we'll be doing is talking about the Mass in a line-by-line detail analysis. But before we do that, I think it would be good to take a look around the church itself, the church building, and explain why things look the way they look, what certain things within a Catholic church mean and symbolize, and why they are there. So in short, we're going to be doing a tour of the church. First of all, we need to talk about the church building in general. And it's a question that I would assume that you've never asked, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Where does the idea of a church building come from? Where did we get it? And to answer that question, we have to go back to the Old Testament. In the book of Exodus, God instructs Moses to build what was called the Tabernacle, which was basically a portable temple used to offer sacrifices that the Israelites would take with them as they journeyed through the desert for 40 years. And God is very specific in the detail that he gives to Moses. He tells him how to construct the tabernacle, how it was to be set up, the exact layout, the exact dimensions. God tells Moses what materials to use for all of the furnishings, all the sacred vessels, and all the vestments for the priests. And the general layout goes something like this. So the tabernacle, this portable temple, would be set up in the center of the Israelite camp. Keep in mind, there's hundreds of thousands of them at this point, of Israelites. And so the tabernacle would be set up in the center, and the people would gather around this tabernacle during specified times of the week and specified times of the year. In terms of the tabernacle itself, picture a large rectangular area about 60 yards long and 30 yards wide, basically 2/3 the size of a football field. And that area is where it was all contained. It was walled off by tent cloth draped over wooden railings that were 15 feet tall. And the general population was not allowed within this walled off area, and that's because this was known as the courtyard of the priests. Like I said several weeks ago, the Israelite liturgy was a private liturgy. The people provided the sacrifices, but it was the priests who carried out the sacrifices within this private courtyard, generally out of the view of the people entirely. At the front of the courtyard of the priests was the altar on which the priests would offer animal sacrifices. This altar was essentially a large stone barbecue. The animals offered in sacrifice were ritualistically slaughtered, drained of their blood, and butchered, and then they were burned as a sacrifice on the altar by the priests. Moving past the altar further into the tabernacle area, you would actually get to the tabernacle itself. The tabernacle is Hebrew for the word tent. And this tent was 15 yards long, so this is within the walled confines of the courtyards of the priests. It was 15 yards long and 5 yards wide, basically the size of a 3-car garage. And inside this tent was first an altar where incense was burned as an offering to God. There was also a golden table for the showbread, which was bread offered to God as a sacrifice, but the bread also represented the presence of God, which we talked about a long time back when we were looking at the Old Testament and how the Eucharist is foreshadowed. But anyways, finally, you have the Holy of Holies at the back of this tabernacle tent. And the Holy of Holies is separated from the rest of that tent by a curtain. And so you pass through the curtain, and within the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest relic of the Israelite people. The Ark contained the tablets of the Ten Commandments, the staff of Aaron that was used against the magicians of Pharaoh, and some of the manna, the bread that came down from heaven each morning, was stored in the Ark of the Covenant itself. The Ark of the Covenant was said to be the seat of God, his throne, where his presence came down upon the earth and rested. And this was the setup for several centuries. Even once the Israelites entered into the Promised Land, this tent served as the place of worship for God's people for hundreds of years, until King Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. But even though this new temple was a wonder of the world, made of stone and gold and silver and bronze and cedar, it maintained the exact layout that was designated by God to Moses, the same layout as the tabernacle in the desert. So within the walls of the temple, now made of stone, you had the courtyard of the Gentiles on the very edges. They weren't allowed very far in because they were not of God's chosen people. Non-Jews were not allowed any further. Moving further into the temple system of courtyards, there was the courtyard of the women, who were also not allowed very far into the temple. And then even further toward the center of the temple, you had the courtyard of the men. And these courtyards, they were all open to the air, and they were on a gigantic scale. King Herod, in the time of Jesus, had expanded these courtyards to be enormous. By the time that Jesus was an adult, the outer courtyards took up nearly 36 acres. It was about 27 football fields worth of space where the people would gather during the high feasts of the year. But even the men were not allowed any further into the temple complex, because once again you had a courtyard where only the priests could enter, just like the tabernacle in the desert. And this is where the altar for burning sacrifices was located. These animal sacrifices were offered on an industrial scale. In the first century, the time around the life of Christ, every year on the Feast of Passover, just one day alone, 250,000 lambs were sacrificed. 1 million people came to Jerusalem each year on the Passover to offer their annual sacrifice. And as you can imagine, there was an elaborate drainage system built into the temple. Enormous quantities of water were used to keep things clean, given the mass slaughter and draining of blood. At the back of the courtyard of the priests, you once again have the tabernacle, except instead of a tent in the time of Jesus, it was a gigantic stone structure that stood over 100 feet tall. It was finished in white, polished stucco that gleamed in the sun. All of it was gilded in gold. Within the tabernacle, you had the same altar of incense. You had the same golden table for the showbread. And then you had the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies was once again behind a curtain. Jewish historians reported that this curtain was as tall as the tabernacle itself, 100 feet tall, and that the fabric of the curtain, it was said to be 3 feet thick. Within the Holy of Holies was said to be the resting place of God himself, and nobody, not even the priests, were allowed behind that curtain. Only the high priest, and even him, only once a year was able to do so. All of this ought to sound familiar. If you think of a Catholic church building, you have the courtyard of the people, the pews, where the people sit, stand, and kneel. You have the courtyard of the priests, the sanctuary, where the priest offers sacrifices. You have the altar, where the sacrifice is made. And then you have the Holy of Holies, the tabernacle, where the presence which contains the living God himself. In some Catholic churches, especially those with a lot of tourists, the tabernacle might even be kept in a different, more quiet room. But generally speaking, when it comes to church architecture, we didn't invent anything new. It's all based on God's design that was given directly to Moses. And this has been the same throughout the history of the church and throughout the world and throughout all the different architectural styles of Catholic churches, from the Roman basilicas to the domed masterpieces of the Byzantine Empire to the spires and flying buttresses of the Gothic cathedrals of the Middle Ages, all the way to Art Deco and the modern churches of the 20th century. They all harken back to the Israelites worshiping in the desert. When you can't recognize that pattern in a church, you know for certain that the architect behind it didn't understand the scriptures or Catholic theology. If you go to the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in Los Angeles, for example, you'll notice that it's made of the most beautiful materials. There's an entire wall that sort of serves as a stained glass window in the sanctuary, but it's not stained glass. It's actually pure alabaster that is so fine and so white that the light shines through it. No expense was spared in this church. It was hundreds of millions of dollars. But the problem is that it doesn't resemble a Catholic church on the inside or the outside. On the outside, it looks like an office building. On the inside, there's the sanctuary in the front, and that's about all you can say resembles a church. The tabernacle is nowhere to be found. The altar isn't even centered where the pews are. When we design our churches, the architecture must reflect what we believe, in that everything that we believe leads us to the Eucharist, which is at the very front of our churches. So that's why churches are laid out the way they are. Next, I want to talk about different types of churches. You may have heard of some of these. One church type, and I actually just mentioned it, was a basilica. We get the word basilica from ancient Rome. In the time before Christ, a basilica was a standard public building within the Roman Empire. It was used for all sorts of purposes, from governmental to legal to administrative purposes, all the way to being used as concert venues. If you were to go back in time to ancient Rome and you saw a Roman basilica, you'd say, oh, that looks like a church. And the reason for that is because the basilicas of the Roman Empire became churches once the empire converted to Christianity in the 4th century. So much so that we even kept the name basilica. But rather than the word basilica referring to a public gathering space, as it did before Christ, within Catholicism, a basilica is a church that has a historic or architectural significance. A church is granted the distinction as a basilica by the Pope himself. There are 2 ranks of basilicas. There are major basilicas and minor basilicas. In the entire world, there's only 4 major basilicas, 4 churches that achieve the rank of a major basilica, and all 4 of them are in Rome. There is the most famous one, which is the Basilica of St. Peter, the largest church in the world, built over the tomb of St. Peter the Apostle. There is the Basilica of St. John Lateran, built on the Lateran Hill in Rome. It serves as the cathedral church for the Archdiocese of Rome. It is the parish church of the Pope. There is the Basilica of St. Mary Major in Rome, which is the largest and oldest church in Rome that is dedicated to Mary, the Mother of God. It was built in the year 431 to celebrate the doctrine of Mary's motherhood. And then you have the Basilica of St. Paul outside the wall, which was built over the tomb of St. Paul, and as you might guess, this church exists outside of the original 1st century Roman walls, but it's well within the modern city limits today. And then you have minor basilicas, and these can be all over the world. Like I said, they're designated as such by the Pope because they are either historically or architecturally important. Think of a basilica in the same way that you would think of it as a building that has been put on the National Register of Historical Places. It's sort of that kind of thing. The closest basilica to here is, of course, the Basilica of St. Fidelis in Victoria, Kansas, just east of Hayes. And there's hundreds of minor basilicas throughout the world, including 93 in the United States alone. Another type of church that you've no doubt heard is a cathedral. The word cathedral comes from the Latin word cathedra, which simply means chair. Why do we call a building a chair? Well, the term chair refers to a seat of authority. Think of the king's throne or the chairman of a board. We use the idea of chairs to represent authority all the time without thinking about it, and it's the same in the Catholic Church. A cathedral is the seat of authority for the bishop of a diocese. And so each diocese has a cathedral. Ours is in Lincoln, the Cathedral of the Risen Christ. Grand Island has theirs in Grand Island. St. Mary's Cathedral, the Archdiocese of Omaha, has St. Cecilia's Cathedral, perhaps the most impressive church in the entire state. And yes, there's an actual physical chair in the cathedral that it's named after. It's not just some sort of abstract figure of speech that we're using. The bishop has his chair in the cathedral that represents his authority. And nobody else is allowed to sit there while the liturgy is being performed, not even the priest assigned to the cathedral as sort of the pastor of that parish. The cathedral is considered to be the mother church of the entire diocese, and so that chair represents the same authority of the bishop over the whole diocese. And because of this, many important liturgies of a diocese take place at the cathedral. In our diocese, this is where new priests are ordained. This is where the bishop celebrates the Chrism Mass, where all of the oils are used in the sacraments to be blessed. So most official liturgies of the bishop take place in the cathedral. To add a layer of confusion, some cathedrals are also basilicas. Not all cathedrals are basilicas, and not all not all basilicas are cathedrals. Basilica, like I said, is a title that can be given to any church, but a cathedral is a title only given to the mother church of a diocese where the bishop presides. And then you have your standard parish churches like this one. These are just called churches. You can have something called a shrine. A shrine is generally a place of pilgrimage that is dedicated to a particular saint or a particular miraculous event. Oftentimes a shrine will contain the relic or even the tomb of a saint. And shrines can vary wildly in their size and in their design. The one that we're most familiar with is no doubt the Our Lady of Fatima shrine in Arapahoe. That's an outdoor shrine. But shrines can also be a building. The Schoenstatt Shrine in Crete, Nebraska, is a small church that can only hold a dozen or so people, but it's a shrine. A shrine can be as small as a dedicated shelf in your bedroom where you have little devotional items that assist you in your prayer. But shrines can also be massive. The largest church in North America is the Basilica Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. This is a shrine, a church that is so huge that it needs 2 full sets of pipes for the pipe organ at both the front and the back of the church, because it takes a couple of seconds for the sound to travel from one end to the other. The final designation of a church building would be a chapel. A chapel is almost always part of a larger structure. I can once again use the Basilica Shrine of the Immaculate Conception as an example. That church building, it's a shrine, it's a basilica, but within it there are over 50 chapels where the Mass can be offered all at the same time. A chapel is a smaller space within a larger structure that is used for a more private prayer or worship. Many larger church buildings have chapels in them that are used for daily Mass because it's much more cost effective to heat or cool a smaller space compared to a giant big old church. Some churches have chapels for 24-hour adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. St. Patrick's in McCook has this. You just type in the code any hour of the day and you can go and pray in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And some chapels are just smaller churches that are used for specific purposes, like a chapel that you might find in a cemetery or a wedding chapel, for example. Those are chapels that do not serve as parish churches. You may have heard on the rare occasion of something called an oratory. I don't even know if any of you have, but an oratory is basically the same thing as a chapel. It's just a smaller room in a building that is used for worship. The only difference is that some oratories are only meant for prayer. They're not designed for the celebration of the Mass. You'll usually find oratories in like convents or monasteries of religious orders where more places for prayer are necessary. However, oratories still exist out there in the wild, not within the convents and monasteries. For example, the Newman Center in Lincoln has a room set up as an oratory. It's called Oratory St. Joseph. And since the beautiful church there is in such high demand for tours and weddings and things like that, there's a separate other place within the Newman Center that you can go to pray. And I think that is a logical place to stop. I had naively started writing this homily thinking that I would do the entire tour of the church in one homily. But we haven't even made it through the front doors of the church yet. So we will save that for next time.